people say nice things about me, I always think you need to talk to Tanya. I wrote this morning while Ed and Gurney were reading. In fact, I've been writing for a good many months a book about, trying to make sense of what I know about race and race relations and the history of race. And it's been very difficult and full of surprises. One of the largest surprises was that I got to the point where I realized I couldn't make sense anymore without talking about work, that the subject couldn't be understood without talk about work. So the biggest chapter in the book is about work. And in order to make sense of that, I had to work back and forth between what I understand of traditional views of work, good work, bad work, and my own experience. In 1973, our colleague, James Baker Hall, made a set of photographs of the tobacco harvest on Owen Flood's place, about 6 miles north. And they were later published in a book. Tobacco Harvest, an elegy it was called appropriately. Yeats wrote somewhere, William Butler Yeats, that things reveal themselves passing away. And I remember that when I look at Jim's photographs now. For in 1973, a force of change had begun to work upon us that we had already experienced, but the extent of which we could not then have imagined. The horse and mule teams had been supplanted by tractors in our fields more than 20 years before. It may have been longer than that since any of us had worked in a tobacco harvest with black people. The Surgeon General's report was 8 years old in 1973. More chemicals, more poisons were in use in tobacco production. That year's crop would be Owen Flood's last. He died in March of the next year. Several of us in that 1973 crew would continue to work together for decades. But the kind of workers we were and the kind of work we were doing were passing from the world, not to be replaced. If today a movie maker should want to reproduce our 1973 tobacco harvest, no such crop could be found, nor any actors who could do our work as we did it. Not long before Owen died, an unsuspecting young man informed him that according to the experts, you no longer needed to use a hoe in your tobacco crop. Owen said, I clean the weeds out of my crop for the same reason I wash my face. His workmanly pride demanded cleanness, a forthright clarity as a part of the beauty he desired as one result of his work. What Jim Hall's photographs show, because he so clearly saw it, was a beautiful crop being harvested entirely by handwork in a beautiful way. The tobacco plants individually and standing together were beautiful. The long curving rows following the contour of the sloping field were beautiful. Too long, you might have heard from a man working the hard, hot way from one end to the other. The cut stick rows were beautiful. The tobacco was beautiful, so carefully loaded on the wagons. The inverted stalks, carefully spaced and regulated, were beautiful, hanging in the barn. And the ground, cleared of the crop, is virtually weedless. We must not forget the harm of tobacco or the difficulty of dealing with the harm of it. At the same time, we should remember the crop as the support of an agrarian artistry that continued for generations and supported, in turn, a local culture that, apart from its harm, was exemplary. What Jim's photographs couldn't show, of course, was the heat, sweatiness, scratchiness, difficulty, and weariness of the work, or the conviviality of it, for especially when we were in the barn, working close together, we were talking on an endless variety of subjects, and we were laughing at somebody's joke or witty remark or some old funniness remembered and retold, which would remind somebody of another. We talked to amuse ourselves and each other, and the talk eased our misery and was precious to us. One of our 1973 crew was a small, swift-witted man by the name of Eddie Sharpe. Eddie was raised as an orphan by his grandparents and two unmarried uncles. He was crippled in one leg by a childhood disease. To avoid explaining the unusual ailment that had done the damage, Eddie always attributed it to polio. And he probably never weighed more than 125 pounds in his life. But his uncles worked hard, setting an example, and Eddie came up behind them, working hard, expecting of himself what they expected of themselves and of him. He always did his full share of whatever work was going on, and I never heard him complain. He and my son went on swapping work as neighbors and friends until 2011, when Eddie died at the age of 65. In 2002, Jim Hull selected and arranged his photographs as a book, Tobacco Harvest, an elegy, to be published by the University Press of Kentucky. And the photographs were exhibited at our county seat here in Newcastle in the late summer, about tobacco cutting time of that year. I wrote an introductory essay to the book, and here's my paragraph about Eddie. When the photographs were shown at Newcastle, Eddie Sharpe was there, looking at his young self at work, by then with 29 more years of such work behind him. Standing in front of one of the pictures, explaining it to a listener who wanted to know, he said, "That was hard work. There wasn't any way you could do it to keep it from being hard. But you wouldn't believe the fun we had." Essayists, you know, are always looking for support. I'll support that with two other little additions. Virginia arranged a tour, a bus tour, not long ago of farms in this county that black people had either owned or run. And I suppose you'd say the first witness on that trip was a black man, not quite as old as I am, named Joe Wright. And Joe Wright defined tobacco cutting for the busload of people as hard work, but a lot of fun. And here's a little scrap of dialogue from Port Royal, my town, a few years ago. "Willie, what was the last year I helped you cut tobacco?" "I don't know, but you know I miss them old times." Good work, like the practice of neighborly love, depends upon a certain propriety or limitation of scale. For work to be pleasing and satisfying to do, good in performance and in result, The scale must not be so large as continuously to enforce haste or overwork. Rightness of scale prevents enough work from becoming too much. The scale is right, particularly in farming, when work can be done at the right time. As the scale of grain farming has increased here in my country, the idea of the right time is ignored or forgotten, and the huge machines, also out of scale, wallow through the rain-softened fields, leaving gouges that would break a true farmer's heart. The issue of scale is fundamental and all-important, but good work is complex in its making. Once the scale is right, other indispensable qualities are combined with it to make the work right. When it is not solitary, work benefits in happiness and quality from good companionship among workers, from obviously the working well together of workers who know one another well. Good work employs the mind as well as the body of the worker. It makes much of the difference between knowing how, using skill, improving with experience, and working by rote, as in effect a machine or a machine part. It makes a great difference for the better if the work is the worker's vocation. People who are in no way called to the work they do, if it is only their job, find no reason to work well, and they feel like slaves. Thank God it's Friday is a slave thought. The Timanowsk Academy Review recently published an address, Education in Art, that Ananda Kumaraswamy presented at Harvard in 1947. And here's what he said about vocation. In a truly civilized society, men should be able to earn their living by doing such work as they would rather be doing than anything else in the world. It is only where, as Plato says, a man's vocation is also his means of livelihood, that, quote, more will be done and better done and more easily than in any other way. That's the end of the quote from Plato. This I have seen with my own eyes in India, where men are proud of their hereditary vocations, whatever these may be. Under these conditions, hours of labor have no meaning, since one is naturally inclined to do as much as one can. The laborer is worthy of his hire, but he is not working for hire, and would often rather work than play or eat. When I read to the end of that last sentence, I laughed because it reminded me of a story. A good many years ago, to write an article for my friend Maury Talene, editor of the Draft Horse Journal, I went with my son to visit a good Amish community in Indiana. Will Schmucker and his nephew Martin Schmucker, whose small farms adjoined, were among the finest breeders of Belgian horses. Toward evening, on the day of our visit, after our business was completed, our hosts began to show us their horses. At Martin's direction, his children, some of them very young, began leading horses from the barns, and one after another, trotting them up and down the lane in front of the farms. The horses were of all ages, and in conformation, motion, and style, they met with remarkable consistency, a high standard of excellence. Excuse me. We were watching what amounted to a horse show of rare quality, put on with considerable painstaking and effort for an audience of two. The two barns between them held a lot of horses, and the show went on at such length that I began to feel uneasy. My son and I had not come to buy horses. Even considering the exhibitors' obvious pride and delight in them, the horses were being shown as a kindness that we had no way of repaying. "Martin," I said, "it's getting late. You all need to be eating your supper." It had not occurred to me that Martin was the third member of the audience. He said, "Around here, we eat when there's nothing better to do."